Hey everyone, what's going on? Phoenix here. Today we're going to be going through something a little bit different. I'm going to be talking about Luminance and the Luminance quests and how I would rebalance them. So Turbine introduced Luminance in November of 2010, the update from Darkness Light. I think I was actually still playing Retail Asheron's Call then. I quit a little bit after that. And then 3 years later, in September 23, the quest for Freedom, John and his legendary quests were introduced. I don't know what kind of name John is for an NPC. It doesn't really fit Asheron's Call, but I think maybe Turbine was kind of done with Asheron's Call at that point. And now that Turbine is out of the picture, 10 years since John was introduced, I thought it would be worth it to look at rebalancing these rewards and the rewards for all of the legendary quests and what that would look like. So I've got my John legendary quests spreadsheet up and I kind of reorganized it, and I have the current Luminance reward, a rebalanced Luminance reward, and then my difficulty rating for the quest. So starting with the easiest quest, we have Count Feanor's Amulet. This is one of the graveyard quests, currently rewards 10,000 Luminance. This is the floor that I made for the Luminance reward, so 10,000 would be the minimum for these quests. And these quests are all easy, so these quests are all going to be rebalanced to 10,000, which is Count Feanor's Amulet, Gurog Creation, Fear Factory, which is getting a little bit of a nerf, and Rescuing Mouth P, which is getting a little bit of a nerf. All of these quests are quite easy to solo and should be in this easiest tier. Then we move up to our mid tier, or I don't know, second lowest tier, which is going to be 15,000 for the reward. So here I have given a buff to the Rented Foundry quest. I do have a video on this quest, but basically you kind of sneak around Gear Knights, and there's lots of lightning rings, and it's a pretty dangerous quest, and you also have to get to it from the Rented Plains. So 10,000 reward just doesn't seem high enough, so bumped it up to 15,000. End of Days, Foundry of Azexi, both fine at 15,000. They're relatively easy, but not too easy. Lost Lore, I've given a little bit of a nerf down to 15,000 from 18,000, just normalized it to this upper mid tier. And a couple more quests that I've given some nerfs to. So I've nerfed Rented Training, Lugian Assault, Liberation of Uzis, and Janthith's Release, all down to 15,000. I think all of these quests are super easy for the reward that you're getting. Then my 20,000 tier, I have Save Karul, a Hoshino quest, deserves to stay at 20,000. Dreamreaver Investigation. This is not necessarily a difficult quest, but you do have to do some setup in getting 2 keys in order to progress in the quest. So that added time. And the Verendi are pretty difficult, so I thought the 20,000 was fair. Purging the Corruption. This is a little bit out in the middle of nowhere, so unless you hold a specific portal tie for this, it's about a 7-click run from Cannith Keep. On top of that, the monsters, the hollows, can be pretty threatening, so the 20,000 reward feels appropriate. And now as we get to the bottom, you'll notice what I've done is a lot of these quests, I've given an initial higher reward, and then on repeat, it's going to be a lower reward to encourage people to run more than just their basic easy quests to get that 30 John points. So the first one I've done this for is Grain Study, kept the initial reward at 30,000 Luminance, which is what it is now, and then bumped down the repeat reward to 15,000 because this, in my opinion, is one of the easier quests. It should be in that kind of low to mid tier reward range. You can have one person open it up and then everyone can just run in and get their reward. Alternatively, soloing it is not that difficult. Four Corners of Dareth. This quest has probably the longest flagging process for any of the legendary quests, except for the last and hardest one, which we'll get into. But I thought it was worthwhile for this to have a really high 50,000 Luminance initial reward and a lower 15,000 Luminance repeat, because the final boss, what you get to do, you don't have to redo the flagging, is very easy, but that initial flagging is just so much. And I've got some buffs here: Ninja Academy, Nanjo Stockade, Serpent Burial Grounds, and Shroud of Emotion, all getting a buff from the 15 to 20,000 range up to 25,000. All of these, except for Shroud of Emotion, are Hoshino quests, and the monsters there just hit really, really hard. You have to have specific melee defense weapons or very good fully steel-tanked armor, and I just think that need for additional equipment or gear and the difficulty justifies that 25,000 reward. For Shroud of Emotion, you have to go through all of the platforms on Rinthid to get to the dungeon, and then it's 4 dungeons with 4 mini bosses. While it's not that difficult and you can run through a lot of it, you can randomly get ringed and die. I just think it deserves a little bit of a buff. Then we get to First Sister, Third Sister, and Second Sister. Don't know why they're out of order, but these currently reward 20,000 luminance and then 1,000 luminance if you turn back in the item that you get. So I've just buffed that slightly to make it 20,000 plus 5,000 for turning back in the item to normalize it to that 25,000 reward tier. Next, we've got Seed of Power. This quest, again, takes you to 3 different dungeons. Actually, 4 different dungeons. So 3 dungeons each to get 1 of the seeds, and then a 4th dungeon to do the final part. The first 3 dungeons can be quite difficult if you're not a specific type of character. Like if you don't have summons, a lot of these quests are harder, but specifically this one because you have to kill a Verendi in the center of the room while all these other Verendi are trying to kill you. So I think this one is justified getting a bit of a bump. Releasing the Light is fine as is. It's 20,000 plus a 5,000 bonus reward for turning in the book, so I think that's appropriate. Tanada, Intercept, and Slaughter is another Hosh quest that I've normalized to this 25,000 tier, so a little bit of a nerf. Dwayne Stark Cavern, appropriate at 30,000. Oubliette of Moor Castle, appropriate at 30,000. And then Moor Castle, this is another quest that has a really high flagging requirement. It's the same as Oubliette of Moor Castle, but I think the quest Oubliette of Moor Castle is appropriate as is. So what I've done is I've given the Moor Castle quest, which is killing Lord Rythrin, an initial bump to 50,000 luminance. And then on repeat, it'll be 30,000 because every time you repeat the quest, you have to do the 3 towers. You don't have to repeat the towers to do Oubliette of Moor Castle. Apostate Finale. So this is a John quest only on Levistress, so this doesn't apply if you don't play on Levistress, but I've just normalized it to the 30,000 reward tier. Halt Derikos Ritual. This is another quest with a really stringent flagging requirement, and while that flag does reward experience on its own, it doesn't reward luminance, and it's not quite to the level of experience that you would want from a quest that takes you to 10 different places that requires lockpick. So what I've done is I've given Halt Derikos Ritual an initial 50,000 reward and then a reduced 30,000 reward after that. Rinthid Foothold, also known as Rinthid Recall Quest. I've bumped this up to 50,000 to make it more rewarding and more encouraging for people to run this quest. Again, you have to go through all of the Rinthid platforms just to get to the dungeon, and then the dungeon itself is quite challenging. The final fight is 5 waves of Verendi, and you have to beat them all. They do the lightning rings that can one-shot you. So this reward, I think, is justified. Slave Master Quest is only 30,000 luminance, and it's like 4 different parts. It's a lot of killing. You can't just run through it. So I think a 50,000 bump is appropriate here. Hive Queen Assault requires you to get tuning forks similar to the bells for the original Althoe Queen quest. So the 40,000 reward for all the setup doesn't seem appropriate, so I bumped this up and normalized it to this 50,000 tier. Bloodstone Investigation is 45,000. I've just bumped it up a little bit to normalize it. This is when you have to run the entire quest, which you currently do on the emulator. That 50,000 seems appropriate. Hoshino Fortress Infiltration, slight bump to normalize it. And if I was going to do this, I would make it so you had to do the entire quest to get that instead of being able to do the gate skip. Rinthid Tentacle Weapons, or Defeating the Curator of Torment, currently rewards 90,000 luminance. I think that's too high, actually, so what I've done is I've given it an initial 100,000 reward and reduced it on repeats to 75,000. On Levistress, the fight's a lot more difficult than it is on a retail Ace server, so maybe on Levistress, it's okay to leave it at the higher 100,000 reward. Empyrean Rescue, this is maybe the worst legendary quest on the entire list. Currently only rewards 35,000 luminance. I've upped that to 100,000 for the first time, and 75,000 on repeat. And on top of that, I think that the smite mechanic for the bosses needs to be removed or no one will ever run this, even at the higher reward tier. Garain's Host, so to get credit for the legendary quest, you have to defeat 7 versions of Garain and get all the books. And you have to have the Moor Lieutenant up in Waiju, which requires a synchronized group to defeat all of the Garains at the same time or within 10 minutes of each other, and turn their hearts in to summon that lieutenant. So getting credit for this is quite difficult. So that's why I've increased it to 100,000 on the first attempt, and then a little bit of a bump on repeats to 75,000. And then in my opinion, the hardest longest setup quest on this list and in the game. This, in order to run this, you have to have completed Releasing the Light, First Sister, Second Sister, Third Sister. Then you have to run 3 different hatches, kill bosses in those hatches, which flags you. You have to get the keys for the gate to Hoshino Fortress, go through Hoshino Fortress, then go through the dungeon for Hoshino Must Die, then fight a boss that the only way I've ever beaten it is by cheesing the fight. I've never been a part of a group that could just straight up fight this because you need a ton of people. It's extremely difficult fight. There's Hoshino mobs. They're respawning constantly. So I've bumped this up quite a bit to a 200,000 initial reward and then 150,000 on repeats. So in the end, with my revised list, the initial amount of luminance you would get from doing all these quests is about 1.1 million. And now on mine, on first attempt, you'd get about 1.5, and on repeats, 1.275 million luminance, and that's without the 500,000 reward from completing 30 John quests. Let me know in the comments what you think about this list. I think it's about time that, servers that are running themselves and not just a base Ace server, maybe rethink some of these rewards, balance them out a little bit, as Turbine clearly did not do that. But that's going to be it for this video. If you want access to these videos before anyone else, you can click the link in this bio and become a channel member. It really does help me out, and I do appreciate all of my channel members. But that's going to be it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.